The ceiling. Question. Can you give me an example, in parallel or parable terms, of the area in which the Sufi teaching operates and how it is done? Answer. Our teaching speaks of, and exists partly in, another world, a higher realm, a different dimension. Here is a parallel of what this means, in one significant way, and what the object of the teaching is. The unknown ceiling. Suppose we have a house with walls, ceilings, floors, and we are inside that house. Let us say that through long-established custom, people can touch and deal with only the floors and walls. If someone were to walk in and say, "Look at the ceiling," the people would be incapable of doing so, rather like a child which often cannot see something, certainly cannot observe it, unless it has been demonstrated to it. Suppose further that the custom of generations was to hang things on walls and not to have anything on the ceilings. Objects on the ceilings might then be invisible to the people at large. So it is with our teaching. We frequently and abundantly assert that people do not think things through, that they make assumptions, such as there is no ceiling, which they do not attempt to verify. But like the intelligent man who would be trying to point out the existence of the ceilings, we do more than constantly draw attention back to the theoretical postulate, there may be ceilings. We provide, in instructional courses, meetings, contact with teachers, observation materials, exercises, call them what you like, the practical means to establish and maintain for the community which is being addressed the experience of the existence of ceilings. Where to find truth. Careful preparation is necessary before people can perceive something which is there all the time. Sadi of Shiraz rightly referred to this in poetic terms when he said, "The adept sees that same thing in a camel as in the beautiful ones of China or Chagil." Again, by the application of a certain concentration capacity, some people induce others to externalize their inner thoughts as a teaching method. These thoughts betray the character and operation of the secondary self, the false personality which, although enabling people to handle many of the circumstances of life, has as its objective the maintenance of itself, and not the progress of the individual beyond quite narrow and shallow limits. Working on the commanding self. This commanding self, in Sufi classical literature styled the nafs-i-amara, is manifested by reactions, hopes and fears, and various opinions and preoccupations. By bringing its operation into view, its limitations, distortions, and peculiarities can be observed, both by the individual himself and by observers. This self is actually largely what most people imagine to be their own personalities, their own and only selves. And it is interposed between objective reality and the real self, the essence of the individual, whose realization is the purpose of Sufi study. Sometimes the manifestation of this self is characterized by ideas or behavior attributed to other people, as can happen in a dream. One modern technician with knowledge of such things has remarked, "It is as if the mental computer has been induced electronically to repeat a part of its programming." The reverse effect is also possible when the teacher, murshid, imparts to the mind of the disciple, murid, concepts which can reach the essence and which therefore cannot be conveyed by the ordinary methods employed in communicating with the conventional self. The precious pearl. People have tried to cultivate this capacity for purposes of personal ambition, and since this is indeed partially possible, its methodology is carefully protected. Such works as Ibn Arabi's Durat al-Fakira, Precious Pearl, give numerous instances both of this mechanism and of how it tends to be independent of what people customarily regard as systemic operation. It can, for example, arise unbidden. It works in people whom one would not immediately suspect of possessing it, because of our usual assumptions about any such capacity. It may not operate at all. Sometimes it is willed, sometimes not. On occasions it functions whether the faculty is being used for good, socially acceptable purposes or not. Traditionally, it can also work for what seem to be trivial purposes, as has been noted with similar extrasensory activity in more recent Western studies. These facts can make it all the more interesting, since such characteristics are not in accord with the usual folkloric beliefs about such matters, and tend to lack inherent relationships with occultism, more directly resembling more modern communications phenomena, though in a very refined form. Understanding with the heart. The Sufis, runs the saying, understand with their hearts what the most learned scholars cannot understand with their minds. The results of the encounter with the Sufi may or may not be at the time or place desired by the learner. They may or may not follow immediately. Other things may have to happen before the full benefit of the meeting can be perceived. One of the more obvious factors at work in such relationships is pointed out in the tale in my book The Dermis Probe, entitled Pomegranates. Work and work. Question: why do Sufis expect people to do physical and mental work? Why do they so often have establishments which have to be kept going by labour? Answer: I first came across this question in myself when I was living in a Sufi settlement where everyone had to work. There were so many important and influential and moneyed people who visited the place that I used to wonder why our teacher did not professionalize things and employ gardeners and so on, rather than having so many people doing things that some of them were manifestly not accustomed to doing. I asked him one evening when he called for questions, "There are people constantly offering large sums of money to us. Would it not give more opportunities for study if we use this money to run the establishment?" Developing one's own understanding. As is the custom among Sufis, he told me to go away and find the answers myself, and then to come back when I had them, to see whether I was only asking frivolous questions. So I spent 3 or 4 weeks on the subject. First, I wrote down all the possible reasons I could think of. Then I wandered about looking at the way in which things were being done, studying life through life, until I came up with the answers. They were these, and by giving them to you I am doing you no favour, since if you had worked them out yourself, you would have gained more. As it is, I will have to give you the opportunity of learning something equivalent by some other procedure. Some people offer money as a substitute for action, and those need to learn that they can serve by greater humility. Hence, money is not taken from them in their own interests. Others may give or offer money and it may be accepted, but it is the teacher who decides how it shall be used, and students are not able to suggest a study or organizational program when they are there to learn. Again, having a working framework means that people can learn all kinds of things which cannot be learnt in the ordinary world, and which are vital to their ability to understand concepts and experiences of an extra-dimensional nature. For instance, if you want to get something done in ordinary terrestrial terms, you may have to have a hierarchical system. This, in turn, may allow people to exercise a latent desire for power which may not be indicated in them. How are you to improve such people if you are in fact encouraging that tendency? You have to work with whom you have, and therefore the kind of organization must afford opportunities for exercising good characteristics and starving negative ones. This cannot be done in an atmosphere where matters are run on the fuels, greed, hope, fear, which are essential to compel people to act and keep acting in the outside world. If, again, you take money from certain people, they, not you, may imagine inwardly that they have bought something. This can encourage their desire for preferment. It can also, on the contrary, cause the person to feel that he or she is not pulling his weight and that he has just purchased his passage, as it were. This is not good for anyone either. Further, there are always people who offer money and, when you take it, assume that you have used it for yourself. People should not be placed in a position where their worst characteristics, in this case suspicion, are exercised. It is one thing to create a situation where people can observe their own undesirable characteristics working, but it is quite another to produce one in which they have this subconscious canker, perhaps not ever exteriorizing it. That would make such a person worse, not better. That is just as bad as the implied moral blackmail where you appear like a saint in order to make them feel respect or that they are unworthy. Incidentally, it is for the last named reason that Sufis refuse to exercise pressure on people by moral persuasion, which accords with modern discoveries in psychology. Though historically we find that it was very little understood in most cultures. It still remains the main source of hypocrisy. Conflicting texts. Question. Some Sufi texts seem to show that a person should be disciplined and dedicated, others that he should be critical and objective. How can these be reconciled? Are all lines straight? Answer. In exactly the same way as, say, mathematics can be reconciled if it is asked, one book says all right angles are 90 degrees, but Einstein says that there is no such thing as a straight line. All lines are curved, hence there are no right angles. You are mixing up two treatments of the same subject, treatments which depend upon the area in which you are working, or the degree of advancement of the student, or both. If the student is unable to adopt both disciplined and critical postures, both linear and holistic thinking, he will not be able to perceive that which is to be perceived. Shabestari makes this point when he teaches that people have to be flexible and to find the path between extremes and opposites. The seeker is always balanced between rejection and faith. Use and abuse of habit of mind. Habit of mind is at one and the same time one of the most useful and most useless instruments in approaching problems. If you choose the right approach, you may solve the problem. But if you cannot choose it and only obey it, you may not be using the best habit for the purpose. The habit which possesses present-day thinking is generally to assume that a disciplined approach will solve all problems. This is run a close second by its opposite, the beguiling but equally partial belief that if discipline is lost, insights are gained. In the story of the moth and the spider, entitled Scientific Advance in my The Magic Monastery, you can see why neither approach, when adopted as certain to provide a solution, will succeed in areas where the mechanical mind or the incoherent one dominate thinking. The would-be Sufi needs guidance precisely because books, texts, while telling you what is needed, do not tell you when. Think of the proverb, "Words have to die if humans are to live." Self-deception. Question. Can you mention something hurtful? Answer. Surely most people can do that. To me, it is hurtful to have to deal with people whom you would like to teach when, pretending to themselves that they seek knowledge, they only want a social community, friendship, togetherness, attention, and the like. All these things are delightful, and all the more delightful when consciously indulged in, rather than found by means of deception. Deception in this case is pretending to oneself that one is studying when one is seeking stimuli. Such people may have the capacity to learn, but they overlay it with shallow aims. They may have been trained to seek smaller satisfactions and to give them grand names. They may, on the other hand, simply be carrying on the demands of babyhood. Rumi said, "When will you cease coveting nuts and raisins?" The condition can be so well established that people are, to all intents and purposes, unconscious of its presence. Undermining lower aspirations. Sufis jolt people from this sleep. Such shocks are often experienced as hurtful until they take effect, when we are always grateful that we have been allowed to encounter them. What is in fact hurtful to humanity does not necessarily feel hurtful at the time. Self-deception is the chief of these. When something real is being studied, lower aims will tend to vanish, and so will the hurtfulness of the effect of the lower preoccupations being assailed. As Sheikh Ghazur-i-Ilahi says in his Irshadat, if the development by means of the Sufi way is profound enough, defects of thinking vanish, having nothing to sustain them. It is not a question of where you go or whether you join a group. It is a question of whether you have been correctly prepared to learn how to learn. The House and the Lord of the House. Bayezid Bistami emphasized the different ranges in perception of truth when he said that the first time he visited the Kaaba at Mecca, he saw the Kaaba. The second time he saw the Lord of the Kaaba. The third time he saw neither of these, not the Kaaba nor the Lord of the Kaaba.